Welcome to a slightly different episode of the Speaking of Steel podcast. In September, we headed to the UK Metals Expo, where our head of price analysis and forecast, Kaye Ayub, hosted panels on the carbon and stainless steel markets. Here's the first of those two panels. Hope you enjoy.
Welcome, everybody. So I'm Kaye Ayub, head of price analysis and forecasts at MEPS International. Today's Speaking of Steel Live, carbon steel discussion. We'll explore the key drivers in the carbon steel market. So firstly, I'll just introduce you to all of our panel members. So we've got Mike Nielsen on the end here from Salzgitter. They are primarily a steel trader and distributor. They operate sort of more of an agency for their German steel mill but more for niche products, for long products, flat products, plates, offshore, but also sourcing globally as well. Next to him we've got Godfrey Watt, who is the president of ISTA, which is the International Steel Trade Association. Today's ISTA members come from not just the UK, but also across Europe and the UAE. Next to Godfrey, we have Christiane Taylor, who is from Tata Steel UK. They're the largest primary steelmaker in the UK, and they serve a variety of customers for both, mainly for flat products, and representatives for Tata can be found in the networking area. And on the end, we have Tom McDougall from All Steels. All Steels are primarily a stockholder sourcing, again, material globally, and they serve some of Europe's leading distributors, and they can be found in F10 in the exhibition hall today. Okay. So one of the key drivers we're going to start off with is demand. So it's obviously been a difficult year in the steel market, and that's been affected primarily by high inflation and high interest rates. We've seen the UK PMI start to pick up recently. I don't know if anybody would like to kick us off and just start and introduce how they see steel demand in the UK market. Christiane, I don't know if you want to start here.
Yes, I can kick off. Can you hear me okay? So, loud enough? Is it loud enough? Yeah, I think so. Yes, okay, as you say, we have the purchasing manager indices now up in the UK, which is really positive, both for construction and manufacturing in general. So that is definitely helping with sentiment. And we are seeing pockets of improvement in underlying demand, particularly in construction. So we've seen some construction projects which were previously delayed being restarted. So that's good. I think the issue obviously, as we discussed previously, Kaye, is the purchasing manager indices in Europe just reflect the sort of lower level of activity that we see in mainland Europe. So the UK, I would say, is definitely in a better macroeconomic position than what we have in mainland Europe, where it is still more challenging. We have lower PMI, so that is impacting on the overall steel market, and that has made 2024 maybe a little tougher than what we thought, but definitely very positive that we have the higher indices now in the UK. And also for now, but also then moving into 2025.
Okay. Mike, how are you seeing things?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's probably been a year and a half of subdued demand in the UK, but the PMI improvement and the reduction in interest rate, I think we've initially already seen an increase in inquiries in the construction sector also, probably companies preparing ready for next year with the lots of projects on pause due to high finance costs, and probably expect those to gather pace as we go into next year. But as for that stimulating orders immediately, no, I haven't really seen an immediate impact from that, and it remains to be seen really if that has an impact in what's traditionally relatively weak in quarter four for the steel industry. But 2025 looks more optimistic.
Do you see anything now, or do you expect anything to improve in the next few months, Tom?
I think there'll be gradual improvement. I think I'm trying to be positive. I think 2025 will be better than 24. Although that's too difficult. I think we follow the S&P construction PMI more. Obviously fell from 53.6 in August to 55.3 in July. It's the house building activity there, but we don't see obviously a lot of steel consumption within that. Everything's pointing towards an elevated risk of possible recession is the issue we see. Most of the players this year are reporting a downturn of circa 30 to 35% over the last 18-month period. But yeah, I think on a positive note, 2025 should see some upward trajectory on demand. And yeah, I think it'll just gradually get better, but currently it's still tough.
Are we seeing the demand, particularly in the distribution sector, affecting sort of inventory levels through the supply chain on the whole? Or, are people looking to destock?
Yeah, I think destocking's definitely already been happening with the high cost of the cost of interest rates, borrowings, obviously expensive demand levels, price falling. All of those contribute to people looking to lower their stock levels. On the back of that, yes, stock is already very low. I think that'll continue. I don't think anyone's going to be too optimistic in terms of putting heavy stocks down at this point in time. But yeah, on the back of that, you are seeing pockets of issues in terms of finding relevant stocks. They're where stockholders in general can make a bit of money if they think they might be the only player out there with those stocks. But yeah, stock levels definitely down.
Might this help when demand does pick up then, if there's low stock levels in the market?
Yeah, you've got to hope that you don't get the same situation we had, post-COVID, where you get an almost fake level of demand, and you get an overbuying again, and that flops back on itself. So hopefully, I think people will have learned from that situation, and will find that people will gradually increase stock levels, and hopefully it'll lead to a level of demand that's easier for manufacturers and fabricators to deal with as well in terms of pricing levels.
Are you seeing that the same in the flat side from your side, Christiane?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously, with everything that stockholders distribution has gone through, I think there has been a trend maybe towards leaner stocks. Right now, I would say yes, service centers are holding off restocking for now, but maybe a little longer than planned. So I think when we do see the sentiment change again, there will be a need to restock more. So that could, I think, help with the apparent demand over the next few months, particularly.
Now, I know imports are always a bit of a divisive topic. And obviously with that, we have the safeguard quotas both in the UK and also in Europe as well. Obviously, we've got the CBAM measures, we've got anti-dumping duties, and we've got obviously all of that on top of Brexit and CBAM coming in the near future. How are the UK businesses coping with the trade barriers into the UK market? Godfrey, what are you hearing on that?
Good afternoon. You've jumped right ahead of me there. That's number question 6, isn't it? Or 7? I don't know.
5.
Where should we start? You asked about the safeguard measures, what effect first off? Or?
Yeah, how are the UK business coping with the steel trade barriers?
Coping, good question. Well, I mean, obviously, safeguard measures have been a factor of the import life for nigh on 6 years, so we're kind of used to them in a sense, although obviously they've always added another layer of risk to the import business. And I think most of our members, and my company included, tend to spend an inordinate amount of time worrying about whether there's quota available when you're shipping, checking whether it still is, and worrying about when it actually physically arrives. Are you going to get clocked for the 25% or aren't you? And often it's, which way is the wind blowing, or taking an educated guess. But for sure you have to work, therefore, with your clients, with your suppliers, and with your docks, in case you need to store stuff there pending the next quarter. So, to find your way around the best way out of each shipment. So it's really a certain hand-to-mouth, in a sense. But now, of course, thanks to our rather clever politicians who negotiated our wonderful Brexit deal, we also have the problem with exports to Northern Ireland from other countries, where you have to have a quota available for the UK as well as the EU. Now, that's double your risk, and the poor sods in Northern Ireland often have to pay the price for that. Thank you very much, Boris and your friends. So that's that bit. Was there another part to your question?
Just how the trade barriers are affecting the UK businesses, basically.
Well, we'll come on to that perhaps later. I would say, by the way, in terms of the PMI, I think the importers are generally one step away from what's actually physically happening in the consumption market, because obviously we're doing forward. I think what I would say is members are seeing increased levels of inquiries from the stockholding trade, which is a good sign. I can't say really more than that on that one. And I think as for an improvement, well, yeah, I think we've had such a long period of low demand that anything looks like an improvement at the minute. I think more the question on that is, will the prices go up? Can they go up alongside that improvement? And obviously that very much depends on global situations as much as our own.
Mike, how are you seeing things affect your customers?
Yeah, well, I think on the question you had on the trade barriers, I think, like Godfrey said, we're well versed in how we need to deal with those these days. We've had them for some time. What's become more difficult in the last year or so is that the policymakers seem to be a little bit slow to put the detail out. So suddenly we're now having to deal with orders that are already on, with suppliers perhaps in other parts of the world, and by the time it arrives, the rules of the game have changed, and that makes it very difficult. So I think perhaps it would be better if there was better timing to how the detail was put out to the market.
Yeah. I'll just add on to that, Mike, you're quite right, and cite the example of when the trade measures were renewed. The first announcement from the previous government actually had about 18 or 19 errors in it, which they then had to correct after the election. So God knows what happened to people in that period, because basically suddenly you could have imported all sorts of things from all sorts of countries, which you weren't supposed to really, according to the measures. That gives you a bit of a flavour for the sort of stuff that you're talking about there, where you actually, because you're booking in advance, you often don't know how it's going to end up by the time it's either on the water or here.
Christiane?
Yeah, just to add on to that, so obviously trade barriers, I think really is trade protection, so it's really protection for the UK steel market rather than barrier as such. It's trying to create a level playing field. What we have seen is in mainland Europe, very strong new trade defence measures now introduced literally this year in the summer. So you have the cap on the hot rolled coil imports from the other country quota. You have the anti-dumping case being instigated for hot rolled against key importing countries. So what we need to make sure in the UK is that we have a level playing field, and that whatever trade defence is implemented in mainland Europe is mirrored in the UK. So if anything, I would say the trade defence in the UK is probably slightly less than what we have in mainland Europe. So just for the steel industry overall, I would say it's very important that we act quickly, and then we have a level playing field, especially with the higher cost base we have in the UK and Europe, with the CO2 costs, which have already having to be paid. So it's important that we implement new measures in the UK as well to mirror the EU.
Yes, Tom?
Yeah, regarding the steel trade barriers, obviously with demand levels being so low over the last sort of 18 months, it hasn't really been a problem on most products. There are other products with issues of their own. I specifically talk about long products from my own point of view. But from a long products, this quarter we are starting to see certain areas where the quotas are being hit. We had Turkish merchant bar, which is exhausted this quarter in early September. That's the first time in quite some time. As demand increases, we'll probably see other products that have the same issue. So it's worth knowing, obviously, these trade measures were put in place over 6 years ago now, so the landscape changes, mills' aggressiveness in certain areas changes, so where one quota might protect you from a certain country, it's another country that might be looking at infiltrating that market. But yeah, we'll get onto it, but the likes of CBAM should again offer another level of protection, which hopefully creates that level playing field, which we require in the UK, especially if we want to continue producing steel.
I mean, if we're looking at the flats, I mean, how are you seeing the proposals for the hot rolled coil downstream processing quota? Christiane, I don't know if you've got any update on how that's progressing?
Yeah, so obviously this has become necessary because we are obviously importing hot rolled substrate, predominantly now from our parent company in India. So this is really nothing additional. It's all about maintaining the status quo. So because we no longer have, during our transition period for Tata Steel UK, we no longer have our own steel make, we'll have to bring in substrate. So we bring that in from predominantly from Europe, from TSN, and then Tata Steel India as well. So the new hot rolled coil downstream processing quota, so most of you will be aware, so we still have the current quota for the other countries, hot rolled, which is the new 1A quota, and then 1B will be the additional quota for downstream processing. And it's very much designed to create as little disruption as possible to enable us as Tata Steel UK to bring in the substrate for hot rolled that we then use for downstream processing. So key message here is really to maintain the status quo and cause as little disruption as possible and enable us to manage our transition to AF effectively.
Godfrey, do you have any comment on how you think that's going to affect the UK market? And the UK
just a few, if you've got the odd hour or two. I guess most people are familiar with why the 1A and 1B split has taken place. Obviously, as we know, Tata have been utilising the other countries' HRC quota probably for some 15 months now, even though they were still producing their own liquid steel for much of that time. And obviously that has been seriously impacting the traditional importers. And by the way, safeguard measures are supposed to reflect and protect traditional trade flows, I'll just remind everybody, and they've been suffering. So there definitely was a desperate need to adjust and find a remedy to that situation. And the idea of creating a separate quotas, the 1A and the 1B, is actually not a bad one. But obviously that's a basic principle, that's fine. The problem is really the way the TRA determination has been framed. Obviously it's not yet in force, but we as ISTA, and I know other members, have actually lodged quite a few objections. So the objections really, well, first off, there's nothing in that draft to control or monitor the correct utilisation of the two sectors, 1A and 1B. It does mean, at the moment, the way it's worded, one lot could actually access the other. There's nothing to actually control it. We're told that the DBT and the HMRC will be creating a wording for controlling that. We haven't seen it yet, and until such time as we do, there are major concerns as to how that's going to work in practice and whether it's going to work fairly in practice. Then secondly, there's the definition of downstream processes in that draft, which are flawed as well as vague. The implication is that they only cover the downstream activities of Tata, which is not true. And those activities are actually also protected by safeguard quotas. But what about things like cold form sections or crash barriers? They're not covered by quotas, they're not protected by quotas, but aren't they a downstream process? So that aspect of it has not been clarified. quite where the hot rolled coil that Tata Distribution themselves process. I don't know where that sits in all this either. The Category 1B is going to be, or can be, global in terms of origins, but Category 1A is still, as it stands, restricted by the existing country allocations, which are based in turn upon out-of-date 2017 to 2019 trade stats, a point that Mike mentioned earlier where things take a long time to change, and that's a long time ago. So obviously, until that's clarified, that's a downside for the importer and the user of imported product. There was mention of playing fields being level earlier. Quite frankly, to me, the way that current TRA wording is, I'd say the playing field's so unlevel that the importers and the imported product are actually in danger of slipping off the pitch.
Just a quick comment, just to address some of the questions. So the downstream processing quotas, so that's not just for Tata Steel. So, for example, tube manufacturers can also access that quota. So that's absolutely fine. Yes, agree. It needs to be needs to be made sure that the procedures are being followed correctly. With regards to the 1A, it's really all we aspire for is very little disruption and maintain the status quo. So we don't really aim for a change in the 1A, and that's why that's just staying as is. So no change there.
Obviously, part of this has been while you move across to the electric arc furnace production.
Yeah.
I mean, how will the move across to electric arc furnace steelmaking impact supply in the UK market in the next few years, do you think?
Yes, I think really exciting. We heard from Rajesh, our CEO, earlier. The move to EAF steelmaking essentially enables our customers to have access to green steel on our doorstep. So we expect that it will make the UK manufacturing sector a lot more competitive. And actually, as we're one of the first in Europe to move to EAF steelmaking, it will give all our customers hopefully a competitive advantage as well to have that immediate access on their doorstep to green steel. So I think that's a really important message that should make the UK manufacturing sector a lot more competitive. In terms of the transition, Kaye, we've discussed it many times. So our key aim is to make this transition as smooth as possible for our customers. So, very little disruption, and working very closely with customers to make sure that the next 3 years work really well, and there's very little change, with the aim then to launch our EAF steelmaking after the transition period.
Do you think the move to EAF will make the UK market better?
Yes, definitely. As I said, with the access to green steel, and also what's important to remember is that we're really aiming to have the same footprint as before in terms of our customer base. So whereas in the US, for example, it's some of the EAF steelmaking is maybe a little more niche. This, for us, it will be the same customer portfolio as before, the same product portfolio. So really a mainstream offering for green steel, and again, as I said earlier, one of the first in Europe, so really exciting future.
And obviously we've seen similar plans, British Steel also moving across to electric arc furnace. I mean, how do you think that might also affect the long market?
I think one thing with electric arc furnace, obviously, is good news for the UK. Makes them more self-sufficient. It'll change the trade flows of certain products. If you look at the likes of iron ore that's coming in, coke and coal, and the likes of exports of scrap. So we're going to have less coming in and less going out. So it'll definitely change the way that that's working. Overall, it's good for the UK's carbon footprint. But I think one thing that needs to happen is energy prices do need to come down to make it successful. It's one thing where the current energy prices do not assist. Obviously, CBAM coming in place as well will also help the UK producers, like British Steel, fingers crossed, and Tata again as well.
What challenges do you think are facing the UK market and trade in the next year? I don't know, Mike, if you've got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, there's a few out there that we can see already, I think, for the next year. And the topic we've just discussed is something the whole market has to get to grips with the domestic industry having a significant share of the market. I think we've also got CBAM coming up, and I don't know, obviously, it's not next year that gets implemented, but I think people will already start to prepare themselves for what could be a step change in supply chains where Boss is out and Arc is in the future. But more imminently, you're probably following some of the trade press at the moment talking about Chinese coils being exported very cheap around the world, and that's a challenge right now. Who knows if that will persist into 2025, but they're three things that I can think of immediately. Not to mention just getting to grips with whatever the final regulation may be. And who knows, in recent years there's always been something else that's come up that nobody's expected, whether it be a war or an earthquake or something else to do with regulation. So there could be quite a bit.
Do you foresee any other challenges, Godfrey?
Same old challenges in some ways. As Mike said, and funny enough, I put that right at the end of my notes, was, well, whatever we're saying here and now, there could be some major escalation in one of the current conflicts or some other thing going on which would turn everything we're saying now right on its head. But assuming not, CBAM I think's a good thing. I'm guessing from the time frame for British Steel and Tata with their EAFs, they'll be more or less in line with when CBAM's going to come into force in the UK, thereabouts.
So CBAM will come in slightly before.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, that the one aim of the CBAM, I think, which is a good one, is to limit carbon leakage, and obviously that does mean you're trying to stop, by way of cost, stuff coming in from another country where they hasn't spent the same amount of money on their carbon emissions, and they're dumping it out cheap because they can find a market. That should stop that, which I think is a good thing. Tom mentioned earlier, by the way, on the EAFs. Yeah, I think in terms of a circular economy, talking about the UK, the EAFs long overdue. I mean, they've been going for years in other countries on flat rolled too. And it's great that we're doing it. I know it's tough for the steelworkers involved, but quite frankly, if it makes our domestic producers more competitive, they're staying alive, they're still employing people, and it's a big thing on the scrap, the iron ore movements, and I think that's all to the good. Obviously, we do need, Tom mentioned the cost of energy. The other thing, of course, is you do really need an increased renewable energy sources to go alongside the EAF production. So that's has to be part of the programme, which obviously is a work in progress. I hope the current government, with their programme about wind energy, is going to ease that. Anyway, that's to be seen. So I think the challenge is, we've already talked about the safeguard quotas. Christiane mentioned, in Europe anyway, some anti-dumping investigations, which I wouldn't mind betting could happen here too. Obviously, the latest media reports about British Steel are a bit unnerving, and I hope that something still good will come from that. So I'd say, by and large, that the outlook and the challenges are not much different from what we're already living with.
I mean, obviously, the move to electric arc furnaces, to reduce emissions. We hear a lot more talk about green steel. And are we finding customers making more inquiries for green steel or lower emission steel?
In one word, yes. Most people now ask what are the emission levels of the various mills that we're buying from. So, yes. I think you put in there a question of, is anybody paying any more for green steel? Well, I don't think anybody's prepared to pay more for anything at the moment in this market, but maybe it'll happen. Not yet.
How about you, Christiane?
Yeah, so definitely. So one of the big reasons, obviously, we're doing the EF is multiple reasons, but also because our customers are asking us for green steel. We've already introduced Optimus and Zeramis as a CO2 reduced offering, and absolutely our customers want the green steel, particularly automotive, construction. So in construction, I would say many customers, the low carbon targets are not just nice to have, but actually essential and a prerequisite for the future. So, and I think there is also appetite, and what we've seen elsewhere in Europe as well, there is, I think that there is the definitely a green steel premium, definitely in the first few years, until maybe the market normalizes and then green steel becomes the norm. But from what we can see, absolutely, there is a green steel premium.
Are you seeing the same on the longs side, Tom?
I definitely agree, Christiane, that the prerequisite is coming from large end users. But then I would echo Godfrey's comment that in the long product sector, people aren't willing to pay the difference yet. It's tough out there, so for the time being, people are just looking to survive. I don't think it will come, but it's going to take some time, and it's going to require a stronger market to fully accept green steel and the cost for it.
Do you think regulatory changes are needed to almost not force people, but encourage people maybe to pay more or buy more green steel?
I think there's a dangerous situation there in terms of the likes of British Steel at the moment. It would be a death sentence to the likes of British Steel currently if there was a regulatory changes. I think it will happen in time, but again, I think, to mention it again, CBAM, that's the reason for CBAM. And that should be sufficient to force the change. So if CBAM's not doing its job, then it's not worth looking at. But the regulatory changes, no. I think it's too dangerous for some of our current domestic producers in the UK.
Is the government doing enough to support the UK steel industry? Do we think?
It's a difficult one to comment on, I guess. From my point of view, obviously from a selfish point of view, it's very difficult because I compete against the producers that I also buy from. So as a taxpayer, obviously, it's very, very important for our market to be self-sufficient. So I think they're doing enough, and what they're doing is obviously very calculated, and they'll continue to do that as best as they can.
Mike, how do you see that, the whole green steel discussion from your...
Yeah, we've definitely seen an increase in inquiries for green steel, or so-called green steel. Everyone has their own brand, don't they, these days, and there's no single definition. But many people want to see an EPD when you deliver the order, and I do think CBAM can be a bit of a catalyst here to make a real step change in the market. So yeah, regulation's important, but we do also see some of that demand coming from companies who have corporate social responsibility aims to reduce carbon. Also in the finance sector, I think there's an increasing amount of ESG investment going on. So some of that is tying people into having lower carbon content in projects. So there's going to be a gradual step over, and I think there's a tipping point somewhere where no stockholder wants two piles of steel, one pile of green steel and one pile of not green steel. So at some point there has to be a choice to convert over towards green steel and hold that, because that's what the customers demand. And so regulation's important, but I don't think it's the only thing in this mix.
No, as Tom said already, we've got CBAM, which should provide a fair bit of regulation. I'd be surprised if it doesn't. We've got already quite strong sustainability controls in construction, so that's already in place. No, a bit like Mike, I rather see when Cares first came out in rebar, you know, at one time there was still a market for non-Cares, and gradually that just faded away. And I think we're going to see a gradual transition. And I think it will be customer-led, that our customers, Mike's already said it, Tom's already said it as well, and Christiane, that actually they'll be saying, well, I want this stuff because it's got lower emissions, I'm not going to buy that one. Or I'm not going to buy it because that's come from the other side of the world, and what about the shipping emissions? And obviously there are controls going in place on shipping carbon emissions as well, but at the moment there's probably quite a few old tubs out there turning up from Turkey that don't quite conform to the current controls. So, you know, but all these things will happen, and I think more regulation would be dangerous, and I'm not quite sure what form it could possibly take at a governmental level anyway. So I think we're fine where we are and what we've got coming through.
So do you think it'll ultimately affect or impact the steel trade flows then going forward as people move across to green steel, that people will start to buy closer to home?
Closer to home's one element. Obviously freight is an element, but of course if you're coming from further afield it might be a bigger ship, so you've got to weigh the pros and cons of, you know, a lorry load coming from Germany or 10,000 tonnes coming from Korea. So you've got to work that out as well. But yeah, I mean, the customer, there will be an impact because customers are going to want it. They're already wanting it. So, and those things being part of the other scopes of CBAM will come into play, like transport. So we will see that as part and parcel of the CBAM operation.
So you think CBAM will help with the adoption of green steel? How will the UK's sort of later adoption, with it coming in 2027 as opposed to 2026, you know, will that have any negative effect in the UK market?
Yeah, it can only have a negative effect. We've become basically a dumping ground for that year, where outside of Europe, basically, it's free for all in terms of where the CBAM's not taking place in the UK compared to Europe. Europe will have that extra layer of protection where we don't. So I think it will, without question, have a negative impact with it being a little bit later. It's definitely not something the UK government should be pushing for. We should be bringing it in line. I think most of the trade feels the same, but yeah, for some reason, it still seems to be holding out with 2027.
So we're working with UK Steel on this as well. I was just talking to Gareth Stace earlier, and it is absolutely crucial that CBAM is introduced at the same time in the UK as it is in mainland Europe. As you say, we will then otherwise face potentially increased imports into the UK. So it's really important. And yeah, just to reiterate, obviously we need to make sure that also the UK is more competitive in terms of export. So that's another issue with CBAM. Of course, so we already have to pay for CO2 costs, but we also need to think about exports from the UK or from Europe into other countries as well, which could be disadvantaged once CBAM comes in. So that there is still some issues, I think, around CBAM that just haven't been worked through, but principally very important that CBAM is adopted at the same time in the UK as in mainland Europe.
The practicalities of that obviously are going to be rather tricky, because Europe's already got the scheme running such that people are already having to make their reports. We obviously haven't got that preliminary provisional scheme already running, so they're getting all their data together, so we are a step behind them. From a practical point of view, and leaving aside whether it's desirable, which I think it is, from a practical point of view, I see that that's going to be rather tricky to catch up.
I think the timing's one aspect of this, that it really should be brought in line with the European Union for CBAM for the reasons that have already been outlined, especially considering that the safeguarding should end mid-2026, so we'll go from a relatively protectionist set of regulations to nothing for 6 months, to then coming back to CBAM regulation, which seems a little bit crazy. I think it's also important to point out the form of what's been proposed at the moment, and it's under consultation, and I hope there are some changes to it, because, for example, in Europe you can fix, or you will know the cost of your carbon at the point that you place an order, and the current proposal for the UK is that you won't know what the cost of that carbon is until you make the import, which I don't think will work very well for any of the industries who are subject to CBAM. So I hope there are also some refinements that are made to it to make it work for everybody.
Other than the negatives, do you think there could be any potential opportunities in that period, or is it there only negatives that we can see?
I think, as Godfrey has said, the only positive at the moment is probably that we're not ready for it, or a lot of companies aren't ready for it. I don't know if that's a positive, but yeah, it's the only potential positive, is that people have got more time to prepare, but it's definitely going to make the landscape very, very difficult to navigate. So it's more of a negative than a positive for sure.
So will CBAM, add to the risk of importing from outside of Europe when it does come in?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's another. It just drives the whole argument around sourcing locally. So it will. Well, first of all, it will start to create a level playing field to begin with. Obviously, we'll have the free allowances to begin with, so it will take a bit of time until it's proper level playing field. But it does drive the debate. Buy locally. There's a lot less risk when you buy local. Why would you risk the CBAM charges, the anti-dumping duties, the quotas, and the freight costs? So there's a lot of arguments, and it will just add to the argument to really buy local, which is the right thing to do.
I think there's probably a good chance that the UK will do some sort of deal with the EU as well, so where CBAM might become less of an issue. Especially given some of the products that we don't produce in the UK, where there'll be some sort of trade deal with the EU. I think that's probably likely. And the other thing to consider is the clean energy combined from those countries. But yeah, I don't necessarily think that it will push other countries outside of what's imported. I think Europe will still be a good buying place for UK industry.
Yeah, I think, I mean, as you'd probably expect as an importer, I'm not sure I agree with the buy locally message entirely. I mean, of course it might be good for domestic industry and the transition to greener steel making, but I don't think we should ignore also that other countries have electric arc furnaces, they have renewable energy, and it's not necessarily the case that they need to go through such a transitional phase. And so I'm sure also that, the announcements so far are not showing an increase in production capacity in steelmaking in the UK, probably the reverse of that. So there will still be a need for import, and it's going to be about finding the right sources for that in a different environment after CBAM.
I think it's Mike.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't take it as read that anything that comes in from outside is necessarily worse in terms of emissions than our own domestic production. We're kind of assuming that we're going to be a dumping ground for all sorts of dirty old shit. Well, actually, that's not necessarily the case. Look at the steelworks around the world. Look how many are far much more modern than our own. So I think it's a little bit scaremongery, that, and still, all the while, more or less, until we get into CBAM, we've still got the quota protection. So let's not forget that either.
Not to gang up on Christiane as the producer, but I think for manufacturers as well, it's very important to still have, as Mike suggested, imports from other countries. We've got to keep our manufacturing businesses competitive. So yeah, I don't think it'll close off other countries at all, as suggested.
Yeah, it won't close off, but it's, when I say local, so Europe and UK, you then don't have the freight costs, you have fewer risks, but yeah, absolutely. With our green steel offering, obviously, especially also drawing on local scrap, we'll have much reduced CO2 footprint, which will be difficult to sort of replicate, I would say, from third country imports, definitely.
In terms of the manufacturing and engineering sectors, I mean, could it potentially drive up costs for local production from their side on the end users? Could we, see an impact on a negative side for them with CBAM?
Yeah, absolutely. CBAM will increase the costs in the UK and Europe, especially. So, finished products from outside of the UK and Europe, further afield. Could people start importing finished goods? Definitely. We're already seeing that without CBAM. So if the cost of steel in the UK for manufacturers increases, then there's a good chance that they will struggle to compete against a finished product that doesn't have any protectionism in. So that's something that definitely needs looking at, something that was missed with the safeguarding, where we have seen manufacturers disappear, where other products where they've got very small amounts of work done to them then become a finished product, basically, avoiding a quota where it's a hollow section with a lasered hole in it, and it's no longer a hollow section, it's now a fencing post, and it's competing against fencing post producers in the UK. We definitely need some form of protectionism for the manufacturers.
Okay. So if we maybe try to finish on a positive note, maybe, bit of a 2025 outlook. Tom, if you want to start us off.
I think I was racking my brain about positive things to say. I think the whether it's very small, but 2025 will be better than 2024. And then if we want to look a little bit longer field, 2026 again should be increased in improvement. So it's getting better. It's just very slow. It's not a localised issue. It's very much a global issue. So we're all in the same boat around the world. So but improvement is definitely happening.
Christiane?
Yeah, so if we look at the different industries, so construction, I think definitely in the UK we have projections plus 2% growth construction from the ONS forecast for 2025. So we should see some improvement, hopefully. So if we look at the GDP growth rates, there should be improvement, slight improvement next year. Also industrial production numbers, both UK and EU are up. So we should see things start to ease. In automotive, there are some challenges which have been faced in 2024, and of course there is the journey to electric vehicles, which is challenging for OEMs. But overall, the forecast is broadly stable, 2025 versus 24, although we have had a reduction in 2024. Packaging demand broadly stable. It tends to be a very stable market for us. And then, of course, the general market will be very much driven by sentiment, but overall, because of the macroeconomic picture, hopefully improving. Definitely in the UK, I think with mainland Europe, it's still more of a question mark, but as we move more into 2025, we should see that improve as well.
Godfrey?
As a salesperson, I suppose I ought to be talking the market up. So I'll try. Tom had a good go. I think the best I can really see is the prices are stable but going up. No big upward bubbles which will then go pop, which I think is a good thing. But I don't see any great drops either. So that's not exciting as a scenario. But I think it's where we are. But that's in general actually a slight positive. I guess we have to look at what's going on in the rest of the world. Chinese economy recently does seem to be picking up somewhat, but it's a concern. India economy looks as though that's on a good upward cycle. What goes on after the elections in the States, not forgetting their own protectionist regimes, will they get worse with Trump coming back in, or will they stay the same with Kamala? I don't know, but something may happen on the trade front there too, and not forgetting that at the moment we are slightly outside of the initial draconian steps that the Trump government took initially. So that's another question. But I think stable and upwards is positive in today's terms.
So I actually am quite positive about 2025, I think. I do think the fall in interest rates are going to help project business get the go-ahead, and I think that construction industry is a big part of the UK steel sector, so that should provide some positivity in the marketplace, coupled with the fact that I don't think supply is getting any easier. When you look at announcements, for example, at British Steel domestically, and see there's a transitional period at Tata that's going to start, that's not going to get any easier. So that should also help stabilise prices. And if demand's a little bit better and that helps stabilise prices, then that should be a good thing.
Excellent.
Thank you for joining us for the latest instalment from the Speaking of Steel podcast. Join us next time for our stainless steel panel debate from the recent UK Metals Expo.